Hey, thank you so much for putting the paper on the program. And it's great to see all of you alive and well and in good health, which is not something to be taken granted for these days. This is a paper about misallocation, but I hope that there's a lot of stuff also in there, in particular structurally, that can be used to study international trade. So as you know very well, there is a large literature that tries to understand whether the misallocation of the factors of production are important for driving income and productivity differences across countries. So this is a paper that is also about that. But in contrast to the existing literature, we're looking at distortions in the markets for intermediate inputs. And we want to link these distortions in particular to things that may be affected by through policy directly. So we're going to link these distortions in intermediate inputs to the role that courts of justice play in the enforcement of contracts between buyers and suppliers. So we're going to study that in the context of India. And we're going to first look at intermediate input bundles across states in India within industries. So effectively, we're going to find that in states that have worse contract enforcement in courts, and that's going to be measured by through the speed of enforcement, the input bundles of the firms appear systematically different, and we interpret that as to some extent coming from distortions. And then we're going to provide a quantitative structural model to try to understand how important these distortions are for aggregate outcomes. Okay? So imperfect enforcement and the distortions from that may distort the technology choice of firms and may distort the organization of productions. So in that sense, you might have the wrong producers doing the wrong tasks. But at the same time, I mean, and as we all know from a large literature in development and other fields, firms have a way to overcome holder problems. For instance, through relational contracts, through contracting with relatives, for instance, and so on. So even though these distortions may be present, they might not actually affect certain firms, and therefore they might also not show up as a wedge, and therefore in our data. Okay. So we're going to use this model and to both estimate the size of distortions and also link these estimated distortions to the quality of the courts of justice in the different states. And we're going to do a counterfactual where we improve the courts of justice to the levels enjoyed by the best state in India. That's going to be Goa, and study how much aggregate productivity would increase in that counterfactual, and the answer is going to be in the ballpark of about 4%. Okay, so I should say these numbers are probably a lower bound, and we kind of make some choices in order to be conservative on that. So it's probably going to be at least 4% on average. So I should also say, so that paper was this paper was not quite finished at the time when we submitted it. In the meantime, we finished it, but we've also started working on some new things very much related to both the context and the question. So if I have a little bit of time, I can mention some things there. Okay, so the data that we work with is the annual survey of industries in India, and we use the rounds from 2001 to 2013. So that's a survey of all formal manufacturing plants that are at least 20 or 10 employees. It's a census of all plants that have at least 100 employees, and for all the plants between 20 and 100, or 10 and 100 if they use power, we have in every year about a fifth of all plants. We're going to drop all plants that are not reporting any intermediate inputs, that are not reporting as operating, or that have insane material shares, which happens because it's microdata. Right? So that leaves us with about 25,000 plants per year. And the really interesting and I think a unique aspect of this data is that you have very detailed information about the mix of intermediate inputs that these plants are using. Okay? So here you see two examples. That's the polished diamond industry on the right here. So this is all single product plants in our data that only report producing polished diamonds, which is one of those 5-digit product codes, which we have both on the output and on the input side. So you see that here, this scatter plot is effectively the the material shares on different types of inputs among these producers. So some plants that produce polished diamonds entirely from rough diamonds. Okay, the share in the materials input basket of rough diamonds is almost 100%. And some others produce polished diamonds almost entirely from cut diamonds. Okay, so these guys here on the bottom right are going to do both the cutting and the polishing of the diamonds, whereas the producers of polished diamonds from cut diamonds, they're just going to be doing the polishing of the diamonds, for instance. Okay, and then you have some couple of firms that produce them from another type of diamond, which they call industrial diamond. Okay, which is a bit different. So what I want to show you with these pictures, and these are just examples, so these things are ubiquitous in the data, is that the materials, the input mixes of plants are very, very different, even within relatively narrow industries. So within, let's say here in this case, producers that only produce polished diamonds. Okay, and we also want to show that some of those differences in the input mixes are to some extent because of variation in what these plants are actually doing. So here it's whether plants are doing just the polishing or both cutting and polishing. So this is to some extent related to differences in, well, the vertical specialization of production, right? Do you do both steps, or do you only do one step, the final step within the plant, okay? So all this data is data on manufacturing plants. So not necessarily in manufacturing firms, but you see similar patterns if you restrict this to single plant firms. Okay, we are going to link that to the quality of courts of justice. So in India, the speed of enforcement is a big problem. So a measure of court quality is the average age of pending cases. We do that for high courts because we think that these are the most relevant courts for the firms. And we calculate this average age of pending cases from microdata on all pending high court cases. Okay? So this average age of pending cases is varying between 1 year in the fastest states and 4.5 years in the slowest states. Okay? On products, we are going to divide all the goods into whether they're homogeneous or relationship specific. According to the Raj classification of goods. So standardized or homogeneous means that these goods are sold on an organized exchange, or for these goods there's a reference price in a trade publication. Okay? Whenever we talk about inputs, we exclude energy and services here because we don't have very detailed data. We treat those as primary inputs. Okay? And for reduced from evidence, which I'm going to tell you about next, we're only using single product plants to be clean. Later on in the structural stuff, we're going to use also multi-product plants. So let me give you, in the interest of time, a short summary of the reduced norm patterns that we find in the data. So the first regression, we regress materials share of the firms in total cost on an interaction of court speed by the state of the plant and some measure of how intensive the industry of the single product plant typically is in relationship specific inputs. Okay. And what we find is a negative and significant coefficient. So if you're in a state where the courts are very slow and you're relying on average relatively heavily on enforcement as measured by the relationship intensity of your industry, then on average you have a lower material share in cost. Okay? And that holds both like in this simple reduced sum regression with state and industry fixed effect. But also if you use an instrumental variable for the court speed, which is coming from the age of the court. So in India, because of the history of the court system, court speed is very strongly associated with how new the court is. The newer courts are much faster because kind of they started with a clean state of cases. So court speed is something that is driving, or is a very strong driver of, sorry, the age of the court is a very strong driver of the speed of the court. We are also having a lot of regressions where we have other industry and state controls and interactions of the two and so on. The second regression that we look at is we look at the mix of intermediate inputs. Okay, so if you're located in a state where the courts are slow, okay, then on average you're tilting your mix of intermediate inputs away from relationship-specific inputs and towards homogeneous inputs. Okay? So again, that works also with an IV and with a lot of controls, and also in the if you identify it from the time variation only, and so on. Okay? And the third fact that we find is that if you are located in a state where the courts are very slow, and on average your industry is very relationship intensive, then the firms appear to be having a longer vertical span of production. Okay? By vertical span of production, we effectively mean whether you produce, for instance, shirts from yarn, so from an input that is very upstream, as opposed to cloth. So how many of these vertical steps in the production process are you doing within that plant? That's of course not exactly the same thing as vertical integration. So it's not about the firm burn. This is entirely about the plant boundary. Okay? And actually, in the work that we're working on now, after this paper, we're looking much more at these patterns of how many subsequent steps firms are doing in a production process and what this is associated with. So in that sense, these reduced term regressions suggest that that there are distortions, and these distortions are coming to some extent because courts are not perfectly enforcing contracts between buyers and suppliers. Okay? So we're going to have a model where weak contract enforcement acts like a tax on certain intermediate inputs, namely those intermediate inputs where you're facing potentially a holder problem, so relationship-specific inputs. Our main identifying assumption will be that slow courts do not affect these other inputs, so the homogeneous intermediate inputs. If they did that, then of course, overall, the importance of these contracting frictions or these enforcement frictions would be even higher. So again, in the spirit of trying to provide a lower bound, we're assuming that courts or there are no enforcement problems on homogeneous inputs. But at the same time, as mentioned in the introduction, there are many ways of avoiding this problem. So you could buy from relatives, have some kind of informal enforcement. You could have long-run relationships. You could switch to a different mode of production. So different organizational form. You might do more or fewer steps in the production process, and so on. So these distortions might not actually show up as a wedge. Okay? So in this model, we want to actually model all these different choices. And then, so you're going to have different ways of producing using different suppliers. Okay, so different production functions for the same output, but also using different suppliers. Distortions will be different across the suppliers. In the spirit of maybe if you're purchasing from your cousin, you might not be facing any distortion. Okay, but if you purchase from a firm whose manager you have never met before, you might be actually facing a holder problem. So we're going to use the structure of the model to back out the distortions from these patterns of observed input use. And they're going to be very similar to these reduced term regressions that I've sketched you just before. So we are facing all these challenges that the misallocation literature has faced in trying to get distortions in factor markets. We don't want to attribute heterogeneity in production technology to misallocation. We don't want to attribute heterogeneity across locations in, prevalence of various industries, comparative advantage, demand parameters, and so on to misallocation. And also very importantly, in particular in the context of a developing country, we don't want to attribute measurement error to misallocation. So these are the challenges. So we're going to have many industries indexed by omega. So think of these as 5-digit goods, okay? And they differ in the suitability for consumption versus intermediate input use. So rubber may be useful as an input for tires, but not for textiles. There's going to be an exogenous mass of firms in each industry, okay? And each of them is going to produce one variety. And households have nested CS preferences, so they consume a bundle of different bundles. Each of those bundles is the bundles of varieties for each of those 5-digit industries. Okay? And each of those 5-digit bundles is made up as a CS aggregate of different varieties, and there is one monopolist in each of those industries. Okay? And firms are monopolistically competitive when they sell to households. So the production process is the place where we're doing kind of most of the innovation. So firms are able to use different production functions to produce the same output. Okay, we call these different production functions recipes, and this is very much motivated by this picture that I've shown you before of the polished diamond producers. Some produce them entirely from rough diamonds, and others produce them entirely from cut diamonds. Okay? So each recipe describes a production function. Okay? Rho, so the rho is the index of the recipe. And each of those production functions uses labor and a set of intermediate inputs that may be different across the different recipes. Okay? And we assume that these production functions have constant returns to scale and that the inputs are complements. Okay, so Cobb-Douglas is fine, perfect complementarity, Leontief is fine as well, and anything in between. Okay? And then for each of those recipes, firms are going to draw techniques. Okay? Techniques are effectively bundles of productivity and supplier draws that are going to be specific to a particular production function, to a particular recipe. So each technique consists of a set of potential suppliers, indexed by S, and for each supplier, an input-augmenting productivity draw, which has a common component and a supplier-specific component. Okay. Then there's also going to be a distortion associated with each of those suppliers. Again, for some suppliers, maybe you're relative, you're not facing a distortion. So then the realization of this TX is going to be very good. But for some others, you might be facing a relatively large distortion. Okay? And we're assuming that these productivities are showing up in a quantitative, quantity augmenting way. Okay, so in front of the quantity in the production function. So given this setup, firms are minimizing the cost over all the techniques from all the different recipes. So they get these bundles for all the different recipes, okay, and they choose the bundle among the recipe that overall gives them the lowest cost at producing the particular output omega. Okay, so distortions are going to be only in relationship-specific inputs. You can microfound them, but the microfoundation is not particularly interesting. And we assume that there are a tax that is paid with labor that is thrown into the ocean. So it's an actual resource cost. Okay? We're making some functional form assumptions to make this cost minimization problem of the firms tractable. So in particular, we're assuming that the number of suppliers above a particular cost threshold is Poisson distributed with a particular exponent, okay, and that may be varying across different goods. So these assumptions give us that the model aggregates in a way that is similar to this Howe-Thacker type of aggregation, where the aggregate production function is Cobb-Douglas, okay, and even though the micro production function may be different from Cobb-Douglas, maybe exhibiting complementarity and so on. Okay, so we can not only solve this cost minimization problem, and the overall cost distribution in each industry will be following an extreme value distribution, but also the cost shares are going to be Cobb-Douglas, are going to be coming from technological parameters, but distorted by the presence of these distortions. So in the absence of distortions, the average and aggregate expenditure shares on the factors would be the ones from a Cobb-Douglas production function, so technologically driven. But the presence of these distortions are going to shift these cost shares away from the undistorted Cobb-Douglas ones. Okay? And the model gives us exactly the expressions for how these distortions map into these moments of the distribution that are going to be kind of these post-selection distortions. So effectively, we want to do counterfactuals where we eliminate that. You can do a hat algebra or something that is very similar to that for these counterfactuals. And let me just mention two more things. So one is we identify these different production functions using a clustering procedure. So effectively, we're drawing circles around these clusters of points in the pictures that I've shown you before. So producers that have relatively similar material share, we're going to say that they have the same production function. Okay? So here, for instance, there are 3 different production functions for producing polished diamonds. These are going to be these 3 different recipes that we use. Okay? And the estimating equations are, again, using these patterns about the composition of the input mix of firms in the different states. Okay? In the absence of distortions, all these firms would be on average using having cost shares that are equal to the Cobb-Douglas implied ones. Okay? The distortions move you away from that. So effectively, a state fixed effect is going to be picking up how, like at least this particular moment of how much, how large the distortions are going to be on average for relationship-specific inputs. Okay? So the identification of wedges is from within recipe variation instead of within industries, okay, across the different states and from the first moment only. So we're not identifying distortions from the variation in postures across firms, but only from the variation in first moments across the different states of India. Okay. So then we need to get some parameters, which I'm not going to get into, but effectively we estimate these equations using GMM. And what we find is that the resulting distortion parameter that we pick up in the GMM is positively associated with, well, it's going to be associated with, it's going to be correlated with the speed of contract enforcement. Very much similarly to the reduced sum regressions that I've shown you before. Okay. And then we need to, once we calibrate a few more parameters, we can do these counterfactuals where we reduce the enforcement frictions to the level enjoyed by the best state. So that's ROA. And we calculate how much aggregate productivity in each of those states increases. And effectively, that's this plot here. So it's somewhere between 0 for the best state and 7% roughly for the slowest state. Okay. So something in that order of magnitude. So overall, there's a huge amount of heterogeneity in intermediate input use. Some of that is because of differences in organization and technology. That's not what we want to call mislocation. So that's what we call recipes. Some of it is due to differences in location. That's what we identify as a wedge. If it's correlated with the courts, then we attribute that to the courts and we use that in our counterfactual. And more generally, the framework, the model is useful as a framework for studying stochastic frictions in an economy with input-output linkages. And if we apply that to the formal in the manufacturing sector, it suggests that the courts of justice are important in shaping distortions in buyer-seller relationships and overall productivity. Thank you.
So thank you, Johannes. We have 7 minutes left for questions. So first, there's a question from Dan Treffler. So Dan thinks that another identifying assumption is that the slowness of courts is not correlated with other factors that matter for input mix choices. So in the empirics, this is equivalent to the IV satisfying exclusion restrictions. And he's asking, are old courts randomly assigned across India? And in the calibration, if there is such a correlation, then you might be attributing too much to courts.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. And in the paper, we are trying to do a lot of things to see whether these assumptions make sense. So we use the IB strategy, which, I mean, we're not claiming is absolutely perfect. And of course, I think it's hard to imagine that kind of the age. So certainly the first high courts were set up in kind of the old colonial cities of the British Empire in British India. So that's not randomly assigned. It's certainly not correlated with many other observable characteristics that we've checked into the regression. So in some sense, I hope that it's going to alleviate a little bit these concerns. We have also done some regressions where we use time variation, where we have studied instances where there are new benches of high courts being set up in particular parts of the state. And we look at whether these newly set up benches cause a change in the input mixes of the firms that are close to those benches in a way like associated with the prediction of the model. And broadly speaking, the evidence is in line with that. So in that sense, yes. But I mean, sure. So in some ways, these are the assumptions that we are making, and we're trying to rule out other things, and we are fairly confident about that. But you know, we're not claiming that our IB is perfect in any way.
So now a question from Giordano. Should we think about distortions as changing cost shares or output elasticities? In other words, are there meaningful markups in the model?
That's a good point, and I unfortunately didn't have time to talk about that. There are no meaningful markups in this model. We are assuming marginal cost pricing, and you can have certain types of markups in such a setting, but it's not trivial, and in any case, we're kind of not separately identifying them. So the way we are thinking of it is that output elasticities are technologically driven, and then the distortions are taking you away from these undistorted postures. So I think in some ways, since we don't have a good way of identifying markups from the other distortions, we're not really talking about that problem. I think it's something that is definitely worth thinking about. Yeah.
And now let me combine two questions. Are industries sorting with respect to court quality? And what about, next question, since every state has a single high court, are you taking into account the distance between the location of the high court and the plant?
Yeah, so these are very good questions. In some ways, it boils down to the question, is entry affected? Or are these firms fixed? So we looked a little bit into that, and we did found evidence that entry is to some extent affected by that. In some ways, and in the appendix of the paper, we have an extension where we model entry and so on. Overall, it would make the impact of these distortions larger. So in that sense, you know, again, in the spirit of being conservative with these numbers, we're giving a lower bound. So that's kind of this. We ran some regressions where we looked at distance to different benches of the court and how far the neighboring court is away, the neighboring state's court is away, and whether that matters. We found a little bit in evidence of that. But in the end, the evidence was not super strong. So in that sense, we didn't pursue it much further. But yeah, all these things are, I think, valid questions.
And then the final two questions, are you using panel or cross-section as ASI data? And are you taking into account differences in labor loss in your production function?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So we're using, in principle, for all the main regressions, you can use the cross-sectional ASI. That's no problem. For these time dimension regressions that I've mentioned very briefly, we're using the panel, of course. But for the rest of the paper, it's not necessarily. Labor laws, yeah. So we also ran some regressions with labor laws, and I mean, it actually does look like the composition of the labor mix, and in particular whether you use contract labor or non-contract labor, is affected by not just the labor laws and these amendments to the Industrial Disputes Act, but also to the quality of enforcement. The reason why we didn't include it in the paper is because the courts that we are observing are not the right instance for the resolution of labor disputes. So labor disputes typically go to labor courts in the first instance, and we don't have very good data on that. So that's why we have preferred to remain silent on this dimension, but it's definitely something very interesting. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Johannes. Our time is up.